Ladies and gentlemen, the motion before us tonight is that this house would go nude. Judging in the chair we have Miss Darren O'Byrne, and then from right to left, Miss Kate Oliver, Mr. Niall Sherry, Miss Kate Hayes Brady, and joining them is Ricky McCoy. He's just joined them. Speaking tonight we have in the first proposition, Team Cougar Town, and that is Miss Ruth Fowler and Mr. Ian Curran. In Team First Opposition we have Nude Gingrich's fourth and fifth wives, that being Christine Simpson and Mark Haughton. In second proposition we have Laughter Means Yes, Emer Duffy and Mr. Liam O'Neill, and in second opposition 99 Problems, but being a bitch ain't one. And that's Miss Sophie Scannell and Miss Dearbhla O'Gorman. So without any further ado, I'd now like to call the first speaker from first proposition, Miss Ruth Fowler.
Despite lots of porn, that problem, ladies and gentlemen, is really, really, really bad sex. What Ian and I want to do is we want to create a scenario in which people have good sex. In doing that, we also think there's other serious problems. Clothes are probably sexist, religion still dominates in our society and has a shaming effect. Clothes create classism, it mystifies sex and it's really ageist, but we'll talk about that later. Our model is basically we think you can be nude wherever and whenever you want. Everywhere, right? We put no limits whatsoever on that. We'll also have sex clubs where you can just have sex in public all the time. Generally, we think you can have sex in public whenever you want. We'll probably put some limit on, you have to be on the age of consent and you probably shouldn't be in a school playground. But, pretty good, right? So, at 3 points, I'm going to talk about why this will lead to better sex. I'm going to talk about why this will lead to better self-identity, and then I'm going to look at how this is empowering and counters conservative religion and stuff like that. Okay, so better sex, right? First of all, sex, the fact that we dress ourselves up and we have this shaming effect and we cover ourselves, it creates this perception that who we are is something we should be embarrassed about. And what that does is it allows the media to create a dialogue of what sex is and what good sex is and what good sex should look like and things like that. We think that's prescriptive in terms of establishing sexual norms, in terms of establishing heterosexuality being the norm, but even different types of positions, things like that, what should get people off, what size people are. I mean, apparently, according to porn, if you watch it, everyone's 9 inches. I've had a lot of sex. That's just not true. Okay, so in terms of breaking down sexual norms, we do think that it actually fashion people will see other body types. They will see that they might be attracted to other body types. They will see that Photoshop possibly lies. I mean, that's probably a good thing. It allows for more honest assessment as well. We think that's good for people. The second thing though is we think it'll just make people more comfortable with themselves, right? How many times have you hooked up with someone and gone home and Jesus, need to turn those lights off. I mean, that's the issue, right? Because people don't actually enjoy sex. Because sex is a thing where you should be as free as possible to have the best sex. But everyone's fucking terrified that someone's looking at them naked. But what that does as well is it gives a power to the act that it shouldn't have, right? It gives a power that when you're having sex, you've given a part of yourself away because necessarily by seeing you naked, this thing that you're ashamed of and no one should really ever get to see, you give a power to another person, you give a power for them to really undermine you and hurt you. And there's no countervailing influence because the countervailing influence is FHM, which tells you, you should have the biggest tits in the world, the smallest waist. Genuinely, and this is my third point under this, how it leads to empowering women. Because women, will no longer be dressing for men. The very act of putting on clothes, you wear high heels, you show off your legs, wear a push-up bra, all those things, they're all, determined, created so that, you appeal to men. And it's even, symbolic in, hot summer, day, whatever, men can walk around the street topless, that's fine. If a woman does so, she's a slut. If a woman does so, she's, trying to get laid. If a woman does so, it's purely for the benefit of a man. We think that's incredibly, divisive in terms of creating, and inequality and stuff like that. We think actually, moving those kind of barriers for women is an incredibly positive thing. Christine.
Okay, so given that FHM can still exist, what if some woman's tits don't look like the tits of a woman in FHM? Won't she already be a bit ashamed that she doesn't look perfect?
No, because you see, you're still operating under an assumption which, that's the norm. You're still operating under an assumption which that's, all that people find attractive. The thing is, right, genuinely, you can have tiny tits and someone's going to get a hard on beside you. That probably wouldn't sell. Honestly, I think that's going to happen. And that happens across the board. Because that's, the big issue with even FHM, the big issue do that, how class issues will be addressed. Self-identity for people. So I've already told you that now elderly people and stuff can have an ownership over their sexuality or an ownership over their bodies that they shouldn't be ashamed of. It's going to be incredibly empowering to walk down the street and know that you shouldn't be ashamed. And sure, will it lead to, will it take a while for that message to filter through? Absolutely. But people are doing this already. The problem is at the moment we tell them no. At the moment when someone's brave enough to say, this is me, this is who I am, we say, Jesus, do we do that? No one wants to see it. That's an unreasonable message for a state to put out. And that's an unfair message for a state to put out, because the state is telling its citizens that they can't be who they are. They can't have an ownership of themselves, right? Because our mental capacities and everything that makes us human is manifested in our physical, right? But at the point at which you're told you're ashamed of, that you should be ashamed of your physical, or that your physical is up for consumption by the state, that the state can dictate how you present that physical, it takes away an ownership from you, right? So it's done by the media, but it's also done by the state, right? We can't legislate for the media, but we can legislate for the state. We can say that the state does absolutely not have a grant to do this. And does that actually genuinely does that have a huge impact on your self-identity? Of course, right? There's a reason we all find the burqa a bit repulsive deep down, right? There's a reason we it just makes it a bit weird, right? It's because it's the idea that you should be covered up, that you should be ashamed. When you demystify the physical and you normalize all sorts of body types and stuff, you allow much greater access to self-awareness and stuff like this, and you're given an ownership of yourself that you're currently not given. Why that's incredibly important is now if you cover up, it's your choice. At the moment, it's prescriptive. We think that's incredibly damaging. And how does this counter conservative religion? Okay. Well, first of all, we think there's going to be lots of sex around the place. That's dead. But secondly, women covering up is linked to this kind of conservatism and stuff like that. But because we fetishize. Because we fetishize bodies and we fetishize the physical, we create this connection between nudity and sex, and then this connection between physical and sex and stuff like that. We think actually at the point at which everyone's naked, we think there'll be much more actual intellectual engagement with sex, and probably more sex. The reason that's really good is because sex taps into your actual primal self, your base desires. You can't lie to yourself in sex, right? What turns you on is you can't deny that to yourself when you're there. We think actually people having more sex is a great thing. We think it'll probably happen in this. We think that leads to a self-knowledge, and it leads to people actively rebelling against things like religion, because every day they're confronted with the physicality and they're confronted with the reality of what they find attractive and things like that. But also it takes away the shaming effect from our society. The thing that hampers us all is a sense of shame, and it's not just it doesn't just happen in the sphere of the physical, but the idea that you should be ashamed of yourself all is something that's incredibly detrimental in society. It's why we don't let ourselves think things that the state tells us not to think. It's why we don't let ourselves explore things. It's why we go and we follow populist agendas and stuff like that, and we're afraid to be that one, because we don't have an ownership of ourselves. We're told we're something we should be embarrassed about, and then those friends are proud to be close. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for her comments, and then to open the case for Nude, which is 4th and 5th wards, welcome Ms. Christine Simpson to the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about intimacy, why sometimes it's alright to keep a part of yourself and choose when you give it away, and why it's alright and more empowering for you to get to make that choice in private occasions, and why that doesn't have to be something you're ashamed of. I'm going to talk about why it's okay to self-define and choose, for example, what your outward appearance wants to say about you, and the sort of self-definition you get by having these appendages as opposed to nudity. But before, I'm going to go through Ruth's points. So, firstly, the idea that we are basically self-imposing a shame on ourselves that means we are less free. She tells us that we see people differently, and we see people as being ashamed of themselves, and we fear things like sexual encounters because of the revelation that entails. That we should be more comfortable with ourselves when we're naked. Well, the point is that you can choose to give that part of yourself away, and that just realises the physicality of that act and is a physical representation of the meaning behind that act. Now, if you choose not to give that act that meaning, you already have no problem stripping off those scenarios. But where you choose to treat that as a serious manifestation of of the privacy you're giving away, of the intimacy you choose to associate with that act, we're okay with you feeling that way. She tells us that we'll all be more comfortable with ourselves because we'll know we're beautiful when a man on the bus prods us in the back with his erection. It's not how people want to be seen. When you are clothed, you can choose the terms on which you are viewed as sexualized. You can choose which way you dress and in which way you want to be seen. If you want to be seen and judged on your personality, you don't have to dress ostentatiously. You can choose the moment of days when you are a sexual being. You can't choose that when a man will naturally find you attractive and tell you so just down there. Anytime you go out in public, and to tell people that should make them feel empowered, that is some way allowing them to have ownership of their identity, firstly reduces that identity to a purely sexual one, and secondly allows anyone who sees them and feels positively towards them to tell them that without them consenting to it and without them wanting to be a part of that person finding them attractive. It's gross, wouldn't it be? Come on. Okay. Thirdly though, she says that no longer women will dress for men. No, they can also be deemed under this rhetoric to undress for men and to walk around naked for men and to hope that they are seen as attractive. She tells us that no, people will never be body conscious because FHM won't be the prevailing narrative. No, when people already have a choice and can already see a range of people who they could find attractive and return to this media-designed image, there is no reason to suspect that won't continue. You can still feel crap about yourself relative to someone you deem more beautiful than you, and that doesn't matter whether you're clothed or not. But you have greater control over that when you're clothed because you can determine the terms on which they view you, the extent to which they can judge your physicality, and the way you'd like to be presented in terms of your personality and the choices you make through your clothing. No thank you. Okay. But then they say that walking down the street, you'll know you're attractive, you'll know that you chose it, and you'll know that you're free. Why is that not true? Because you only have one identity. The fact that they tell you is that you should be ashamed, and that worries us. The difference is that people think in their own heads that they are ashamed. It's not that everyone walking down the street does judge you, it's that you worry that they judge you. The people who have that opinion of themselves will still have that opinion of themselves. And so when initially they enter into this nudity stuff, or like the colony or just general society, we say that they might have a feeling of relief or change or non-conformity now and really enjoy that for like 2 days because it's a bit weird and cool to have your bits out. After that though, their same insecurities that would exist in wider society continue to exist. Because if you still think that people judge you based on your physical appearance, being nude just exemplifies that further. It doesn't help, Liam.
The difference is, when you live in a society where there's nothing you can do to do that, you're not told that you have to do things to change who you are.
Okay, except that there is nothing you can do to change who you are because everyone can see what size your cock is when you walk down the street. So if you have an insecurity that at the moment affects you in the bedroom, you can at least not be judged on that the first second you meet someone. It means you can be judged on being an entire person as opposed to the first thing they see, which won't help sexual insecurities when people reject you for your tiny penis. That's not particularly helpful. Not particularly helpful. Be that anti-gay or religious or whatever else, okay? Well, firstly, conservatives will not particularly buy into the narrative of gay people being nice, friendly people when all they see or can paint it to see is those people shagging in parks, when their children have to genuinely be afraid of seeing orgies down the street. That doesn't liberalise minds, no matter what sort of combination of people are involved in that. It means that people who don't consent to this or don't particularly want to are either pressured into this and being judged in a way that is worse than currently because they've less control over how they portray themselves, or they reject it. You still get this dichotomy, and they still judge those nudes, and you still get the prevailing narrative you have. Secondly then, Ruth tells us we'll have more sex. No thank you. Alright, well that just means you're confronted by your sexuality all of the time, and the extent to which you have, if people are more sexual than you, or more overt than you have to deal with that all the time. That doesn't empower people, it simply makes them more afraid. Why is intimacy okay then? Okay, that would be because it's a revelation of ourselves physically in the same way that we do a layer by layer mentally. When you get to know someone, you feel more comfortable displaying the bits that you have chosen to project, the bits that you can feel good about, the things, for example, like the way you dress yourself because you feel most comfortable or confident that way. And when you get to reveal yourself layer by layer, so what if it's scary? The fact is that you are trusting them, and the fact that it is scary is because you are entering into something that you give some meaning to, and they choose to give it meaning. If you want that sex to be meaningless, you don't care about turning off the lights, you're already not ashamed about your body, you already want to get involved in that. But it fetishizes the physical because it's the first thing you see. They tell you that no one will judge you based on that. Why? Why isn't it? If people judge people's clothes, won't they judge the things you can't change about yourself? That's much worse because that is intrinsically you they're attacking able to define in this way? Well, that's because you get a choice every morning of the kind of public mask you'd like to present to people. You can be honest with people, you can be honest about your inner self should you choose to. You can hide that away, or if every day you choose to put on a different costume and embrace that, you can do that too. You can reject whether or not you have certain political values, social values, the sorts of thing you buy into when you get to choose your dress. And you get to judge the terms that everyone else sees you on. So you get to choose, for example, what you are representing when you put on those things. You get to be individual. You don't get to be individual when nudity is your uniform. You lose that way in which you can express yourself. Because you can still be judged, but with less control. If you have less confidence in the way you were born, you can change that and become more confident in your entire person at the moment. Because choosing the adornments that we wear can also be a valuable part of what we consider ourselves to be and to present ourselves as being. That doesn't mean we're being shallow, it just means we can protect ourselves from revealing our most vulnerable parts to everyone else. It's not weird, and it's not being conservative, to say that maybe not everyone wants to be judged by a whole bunch of naked people as just a sexual object, while showing them their sexual objects all of the time. And to suggest that that is empowering simply ignores what actually makes people feel comfortable, what makes people feel like individuals, and what makes people feel free. So we oppose.
Thank the speaker for her comments, and now welcome to continue the case for Team First Proposition, Mr. Ian Curran.
I'm nude from the waist down. Okay, what am I going to do? Ruth's right, I'm going to talk about the class element of this. I'm going to talk about how this necessarily breaks down a specific problem that we have in our society in terms of how we view each other based on the clothes that we wear. But firstly, I'm going to deal with roughly 6 pieces of rebuttal. Firstly, Christine tells you that you have a choice in the status quo. You have a choice in the way that you present yourself, you have a choice in the way that you present yourself to other people and the clothes that you wear. I call bullshit. Does she not believe that men control the advertising world? Does she not realise that men invented makeup? There's a reason why. There is a reason for that, ladies and gentlemen. We don't really have a huge amount of choice in the way that we present ourselves. Specifically, women don't have a huge amount of choice in the way that they represent themselves. I'm going to deal with that a bit later on in a bit more detail. Secondly, she tells you that someone finding you attractive and that manifesting itself as now an erection is a specific harm that comes from the proposition. We say no. We say she said prodding you with his erection is the exact quote. But that still happens in the status quo. A guy men still get erections and sometimes they're visible and sometimes that's not a specific harm that falls under, that comes from our. Currently, she says, it's really bad. It's really bad because, now men can walk down the street, they can't hide the fact that they have a small penis. Okay, right? That might be true. That might be true that some people would judge them, but here's the thing, right? Specifically for women or for gay men, and now it is a thing that people get to see lots of different sizes of cock and realise that it's not all the same. Not everyone is an 11-incher, and not everyone. And we think that is necessarily a good thing. Ask Liam. No. So here's a question for you, just on the fourth piece of rebuttal. It's a question that I think needs to be addressed in this debate, right? Why do kids run around naked on beaches when they're 4 and 5 and 6 years old? Why do they do that? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because shame isn't something that's inherent, unlike Christine tells you that it is, right? Shame isn't something inherent. Being ashamed of your body is not something that you're born with. It's something that's thrust upon you from a very early age. From when you're 10 years old and your mother tells you that you have to wear a bathing suit, that's shame. That's thrust upon you. Poor choice of words, I'm sorry. but it is. It's something, it's like she says, it's a mask, right? But the thing is that Christine says that it's a mask that we put on. But she never tells you this. She never tells you that it's a mask that we put on and that we can never take off. And that we're never told that we can take it off. And that's the key point. It might be a mask, but it's a mask that's stuck to you, okay? I'll take a second.
People find various different aspects of sex at different levels of importance. Some people find giving their virginity away important, some don't. Why are you saying that the reveal of taking off your clothes can't be important for some people?
Well, we're saying that it can be important for some people. We're not like saying that like what we're doing is facilitating people like who want to be nude, being nude. We're not saying that everyone literally has to go out and take off their clothes on the street and run down O'Connell Street. What we're saying is that like people who want to be nude and feel like that is something that they could benefit from, and seeing other people like that, like we're facilitating that. So on to this idea of the class element. Like, excuse me. People don't just feel inadequate in terms of sex because of their body mass, because of the way it looks, because of their pallor, because of their freckles. People don't just feel inadequate because of that. Like, they also feel inadequate because of the way other people present their sexuality in the way that they dress, okay? Like, people are much less willing to be sexually attracted, or much less willing to, like, sexually engage with someone, or like, at least admit attraction to someone if they perceive that they're from dissimilar classes, right? And the way that those, like, that specific like class element manifests itself is through the fact that she's wearing Gucci and I'm wearing Adidas, right? We think that that's necessarily a bad thing. We think that if you were attracted to someone at all, like something as arbitrary as the clothing that they're wearing or the brand, like we don't think that that should be necessarily relevant. Like, we say that this negates that element. Like, now presentation of your body has very little to do with it. Now, like the way you, like the fact that you don't wear like a push-up bra, for example, has very little to do with it. Like, it doesn't break down class barriers, like totally. It doesn't break down things like the fact that I have a north side accent and she has a south side accent. It doesn't break down like class barriers in terms of things like hairstyles. But it's a start. It's one barrier that we think that people shouldn't necessarily have to deal with. It's one barrier that we think that people take in a second. Like, that people can actually, now like breach, right? We think that that's incredibly important. Now at least people, like in any way interested in each other, don't feel put off by the fact that they're wearing dissimilar clothing. Like, people might now have better sex with better partners because there's essentially like a class cross-pollination. Because we think we don't necessarily think that should be something that defines who you have sex with. We don't think there should be something that defines who you tell that you find them attractive.
Those class barriers exist because these classes aren't actually interacting very much at the moment.
Okay, and the way that we get classes to interact is to break down the barriers that make them classes in the first place. Like, the breakdown of the arbitrary barriers, like the amount of money in my pocket, like my accent, or like my clothing. I think clothing is like an incredibly important one thing. But it doesn't even have to be sexual interest, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't even have to be sexual interest in terms of what we're trying to achieve here. It can just be friendship. It can be entirely platonic. What we're saying now is that there is an exchange of ideas, an exchange of discussion. And one barrier to discussion is a barrier to discussion. And if this breaks down that barrier, we're perfectly happy to do that. Because under the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, the body is the ultimate commodity. Because it's not just about the quality of the content of the character of that person. It's not just about what they're like. It's not just about how nice they are and how they speak to people. It's about the fucking wrapping paper. It's about what they're dressed in. It's about the wrapping paper. And that idea of dressing up the real is exactly what leads to this idea of the acquisitional nature of sex under patriarchal norms. That idea that it's about accumulation of sexual contact. That idea that it's about accumulating quality of contact as well. That idea that you should have sex with someone who looks a certain way. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, what builds confidence more? The fact that now you're naked, or the fact that that you never get to see anyone naked and you don't have to show your shame, or the fact that the only people that you ever get to see are models. The fact that the only people that you ever get to see have basketball boobs. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Speaker for his comments, and now call on Mr. Mark Haughton to continue the case for the opposition.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, to continue the case of the opposition, I want to look at two things. First of all, I want to take a look at why the over-sexualization, as some people perceive it as a society now, is problematic, why it therefore continues to be problematic in this proposition, and why they increase that. Then I want to move on and I want to take a look at why people might want to keep their physical selves to themselves, and why that is a valid choice that they make, which they undermine with their proposition by telling young people that's an illegitimate choice for them to make. Before that, 4 points of rebuttal. Firstly, recognize that the last speech was inherently classist in that it tells you that people who are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds can never dress well and can never shake off their Celtic jerseys, and so therefore we always know exactly who they are. That is simply not true in the real world, right? So that's a bit problematic. The real reason why you don't get much of an interaction across barriers, which we think there is actually quite a bit of, and so they're being a bit disingenuous to say there isn't, but the real reason is because you get these types of people living in different places, working in different places, socializing in different places. None of that changes just because some people are now having sex on the street. That's a mad thing to say. The next thing they tell us is that it breaks down shame. The only metric which they have for proving this is that you might see somebody get a hard-on beside you, and that therefore will mean you're no longer ashamed of your body. The last speaker tells us that that happens under the status quo because sometimes men get hard-ons, so therefore, according to their metric, people shouldn't be ashamed. Why isn't that the case? Well, because it's a stupid metric for showing why people won't get ashamed. No, thank you. Well, firstly, because we don't think that guys get hard-ons every time they see a girl they like. That's simply a ridiculous thing to say. Secondly, once you normalize them seeing naked people in society, you can make it even less likely to get hard-ons all the time. So that's pretty bad. Also because people can see other people beside them and compare themselves all the time. It is in comparing people that they feel bad, not in what one random person happens to think of them. Then they tell us that the status quo is bad because we have no choice in how we display ourselves and we're automatically put into one caste and there we stay. Firstly, patently untrue. People change themselves all the time. Often teenagers experiment with the different types of clothes they wear in order to experiment with what kind of a person they want to express themselves as, something they cut out or they tell people they shouldn't be doing. But secondly, you don't make it better that people can't choose what clothes they have by dictating this should be the way that everyone has to dress. So that's pretty stupid too. Then they tell us that clothes are a mask we can't shake off, except that there are very many people who do manage to be very promiscuous and do manage to not mind showing their body up to other people. So clearly it's not true that they can't shake off that mask. So that's pretty much their case. No. So let's talk about over-sexualization as it happens under the status quo. Is over-sexualization of the body something which people object to right now simply because it is male-dominated, because it is a male-advertised thing? That's not exactly the case. Because not everybody wants to think about sex all of the time. In fact, some people would rather go on their bus ride without seeing ads which have people in very little clothing. In the exact same sense that they'd rather take their bus ride without seeing other people having sex on that bus or on that tram, right? So it is the fact that sex is so prevalent for people who don't want to have sex all of the time, right? That's particularly problematic. What happens is that they're told they should want sex all of the time. They're told that should be the be-all and end-all of all of their social interactions. No, thank you. That already happens under the status quo, and we get all of this advertising and telling us that how we are valuable is in who we have sex with. And that's the kind of discourse you get between friends saying, look at who I got with, therefore that's me saying that I am valuable. Right? That happens more under their proposition, and people are therefore more forced into being over-sexualized and more forced into talking about the kinds of better sex they've had with people who happen to be more physically attractive and things like that, because physical attractiveness is still something which is going to exist, obviously. We think it's a problem for people who aren't confident in their own bodies. You make that even worse now when you say, oh sure, but you can still wear some clothes if you happen to want to. When everybody, or the majority of people, are going to be going around without clothes on, the message there is obviously the person who chooses to cover up must have something hideous to hide, and must have something horribly wrong with them, and we think that's incredibly harmful. Especially when you want to look at teenagers with their bodies developing, which can be a very awkward and uncomfortable time in somebody's life, which they might not want to share with the entire world. So it's particularly problematic when you tell them that they should, and that that's the cool thing for them to do. That's particularly harmful. Go on.
Okay, but is the problem the actual physical act of sex being put in front of us, or is it like the nudity part of the sex, or is it the sexual act in itself? Is there something more to the sexual act than the physical?
It is the encouraging of people to have sex all of the time, which brands sex in one specific way for them, which is solely for enjoyment and not as something which might be the natural end goal of their relationships. Because what we recognize is we want to strike a balance in which all of these things are open to people. Under the status quo, it is much more open to people. If they want to go to coppers and have promiscuous sex, that is very much open to them. Or if they want to keep themselves, they can. What happens under their proposition is the second thing I want to talk about, is that from a very young age, people are open to people having sex all the time, to people being naked all of the time. The difference between children running on a beach and adults walking around naked is that the sexual organs of children are not for sex, so they're not something which somebody might want to keep to the bedroom or might want to keep for their sexual partners at that time in their lives. However, as people grow up, they happen to think that perhaps that is something that they would like to withhold, because that can make sex more meaningful for some people as the end point of those relationships. No, thank you. We think it is the physical manifestation in that sense of the intimate relationship that they want sex to be, and that's a legitimate choice for people to make in that situation. We think people aren't forced into that in any meaningful sense by any sort of a patriarchy under the status quo. In fact, it's almost the opposite. There's already a lot of pressure on people to go out and have sex, right? So we think that for people who do want to be modest, that is much harder for them under the status quo, so that's particularly problematic, right? But what happens then under their proposition is that they make that a whole lot worse by throwing sex into people's faces all the time and saying that it's something which they almost have to open up to anybody who happens to be around them. It means that their intimate relationships that they want to have with people will always be clouded with their first interactions with sex, which are often going to be very open if they're living in this very open society, which means that intimate section of that relationship really isn't something that they can ever get back. That's particularly harmful. That's not something which we want people to automatically step into. We think it's a good situation where people have to make choices and what slants that they're going to opt into. Not that one is very much forced in their face in the way that this proposition causes it to. So that's clearly problematic in that sense. So what I've talked about in terms of extending this case is first of all taking a look at where the problems with over-sexualization lie. So it is not specifically because they are male-dominated, but more because that people don't always want to think about sex all the time. And just because some people who happen to be young want to do that doesn't necessarily mean that that's something which everybody has to be in all the time. And then I moved on and looked at further harms which come when people's bodies are always connotated with sex, and sex is in people's face all the time, and that leads to the fact that people can't reach the intimate relationships they would want to. I moved through this.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his comments and ask Ms. Emer Duffy from the second proposition, laughter means yes, to open the case for her team.
First of all, Madam Speaker, I think we can all appreciate how seriously our team takes sex from the very serious nature of our team name. What we're going to be doing in second prop extension is we're going to be talking about exactly what first opt want. And like Mark tells you in reaction to my POI, the physical act is what we're confronted with. And what we want to challenge in second proposition is that sex is a physical act. We say that we have to demystify the physical so we can transcend it. We have to demystify the physicality of sex so that we can transcend it, and so that sex can mean more and sex can be more, and so we can have these meaningful relationships and the meaningful sex that opposition want and proposition want, and probably we all want. I mean, come on, man. Anyway, he tells you that also that being branded solely for enjoyment is also a problem. And I'm going to come back to this because we think it is a major problem. We think that sex is about more, and sex can be about more. Maybe sex isn't about more. Maybe it is literally just a physical act, in which case you're probably going to be fine. Whatever way we do anything. Okay, so first of all, before I talk about anything, I just want to talk about why we think more nudity equals less shame. Because we think that this idea that because I think the whole problem is that first opposition tell you that more nudity equals more sex being shoved in our faces. And we think what that means is that they are literally telling you that they can't see a naked body and think of anything other than sex. We think that's the problem within our society. We think that's the problem. We don't think it's that the difference between a child's sexual organs and adult sexual organs. We think it's about the intent. We think it's about that idea. They say that, no, it should all just be about the choices that you want to make and the choices that you decide. But we think that there's a problem when you feel that the part of you that you're sharing with someone else that's special is your body. We think that's the problem with the opposition case so far. We think that this idea that what you're choosing to reveal is your body and not something else. That you're choosing to reveal your sexual organs and not you as a sexual being. We think that we need to deconstruct the idea, of this idea that there's a barrier between your sexual self and your non-sexual self, and that barrier is clothing.
and the barriers when you decide to have sex with someone. We think that the benefits of doing that, by deconstructing this idea of like sexual equals naked and non-sexual equals clothed, means that if we're all walking around naked, okay, bear with me. Imagine it if you want to, if you're not going to get too aroused by it. Okay, if we're all walking around naked, and being naked is just something we do, and being naked is just something that we want to do, or we're like peer pressured to do, or whatever. We're all walking around naked, okay? What we think that means, now thank you, if we're deconstructing this idea, there's a barrier between your sexual self and your non-sexual self. We think this is going to be especially beneficial for minorities. We think it's going to be especially beneficial for the gay community. Why is that? No, thank you. Because we think that if there's no barrier between your sexual self and your non-sexual self, that you can't be told that you need to hide being gay. We think that you don't get told that you have to hide your fetish. We don't think that you get told that this is some choice you're making in the sexual arena, and that this isn't part of you, that this isn't inherent to you, that this doesn't matter to who you are and to your identity, but it's something that you should have to hide, and something that you should have to be ashamed of. Because we don't think that this shame is just this thing that happens. Like, we think that shame came about, shame came about as guilt being a capacity to control us, to control our sexual appetites. We think it did happen within religion, as like first problem we talked to you about, the conservative nature of religion, that being a problem. No, thank you. But yeah, transcendence. Why do we think that's a cool thing? Why do we think not having to hide your inner self is a good thing? No, thank you. Because we think there's more to life than just life. We think there's more to life than just breathing. And we think that's why we're not content just wandering around and eating and shitting and having sex. Nice. Why is that? We think there's more to it. We think there is something else. We think there's some other capacity to do something else. And we think that the first barrier to that is like ourself, and what does being ourself mean? And who are we really? And we think that those are these social crutch and this social construct that you don't have to get to know yourself, because Abercrombie and Fitch can decide who you are for you, and you can just borrow that identity. I think Christine likes that. Why do you like Christine?
Their full self, all their flaws and their frailties physically and mentally. Even your own first half are willing to say that those people should be entitled to have that dignity of just keeping that to themselves. Those people are allowed to opt out. So why does this private, public, sexual, non-sexual distinction go away?
Okay, we think that ideally we'd like to give people this option, but we'd like to believe that people will just get on board with it because it's going to be really awesome. We think that, yeah, we want to give people the option, but we think in our ideal scenario, no one's going to want the alternative and no one's going to want the clothes. They're not going to want Abercrombie and Fitch and DKNY decide, and like Carla deciding what their identity is for them so they can put that on for the day. And we don't think that we should want to have someone do that for ourselves. We think giving someone that crutch is saying that you don't have to decide who you are. It doesn't matter. You can just shuffle through. You can just shuffle off this mortal coil, never having to question yourself, never having to question your existence, never having to question your relation to those around you and to yourself, never have to question what anything means to you, because everything is in the physical realm of the shallow and the meaningless. Everything is a borrowed meaning, and everything is someone else's meaning that you're just borrowing for the moment, nothing that you've created for yourself. We think that if you're walking around naked, that people don't get to judge you by what you're wearing, that they're either forced to judge, like, that they get your body, which is, like, pretty similar to everyone else's body of your gender. And, like, also, actually, it's not even that similar to everyone's body of your gender. I think that's also a good thing. Like, you know, the thing like, where women went on the walk to, like, protest against, like, labiaplasty surgery? Because, like, we think that people feeling, like, even their sexual genitalia don't, like, deserve their individuality, but they have to conform to some pornographic ideal. We think that's pretty disgusting, okay? So we want people to be able to transcend this. And we want people to transcend that for themselves, so they can have this capacity to do this. Because we think that's all about why we value religion. We think that's all about why we value philosophy. Because it's about this capacity to try and access the transcendent. And we think that keeping us in the physical realm denies us that capacity. We think it also matters for sex, because if sex is only a physical act, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what kind of connection I make with you. It doesn't matter if I only see what clothes you're wearing, because that's all you are, and that's all I am, and we're only just physical beings. Whereas if we're all walking around nude, and we're all just naked bodies, then we have to think that there's something more to us. We have to think that two naked bodies coming together is something different. There has to be something else that we're not getting about sex. Like when they tell you it's a physical act, they reduce that. They allow you to think that it is just that. When Christine says that we want people to be able to choose what parts of themselves they reveal to others, we think that the magical part of you that you can reveal to the other is the part that you don't even know yourself, and they don't want you to have to know yourself. We want you to get to know that part of yourself. We want your sexual partner to get to know that part of yourself. That's the part of you that you get to decide who you want to display to.
We welcome Ms. Sophie Scannell to continue the arguments for the opposition side of the House.
Madam Speaker, one of the most demeaning things on TV right now is when Dearbhla McCall stands next to you in her size 8 bra and stretchy pants, makes you stand on a weighing scale and you're not size 8 bra and stretchy pants, and admit to your insecurities. Having to stand in front of someone and admit to your insecurities is one of the most difficult things you can ever be forced to do. Because what they are trying to do with the world they create is that every time someone has to admit they're insecure about something and cover something up, they make it very, very obvious that they're insecure about that thing and they have to cover it up. We think that's a problem. I want to talk about 3 things. First of all, the idea of how social structures can be defined by image. How we think image can be tied to clothing. I think that's totally okay. Second of all, how we're okay in certain circumstances with you limiting your personal exposure and your personal expression. And third of all, the idea of how even if society is created by clothing, even if security is created by clothing, we think that's entirely fine. We think that's something you can buy into as against being forced to. My one-point rebuttal, first of all, is to Emer. Because, sexuality isn't a core characteristic of every single person. Sexuality isn't equal to your sex organs. And when Emer tells us that people have this inner self that she wants them to display, and when she wants everyone to see your sexual orientation when you're walking around with no clothes on, no one knows my sexuality, and no one knows my inner self from seeing my naked body, or a damn hope not. And thank you. And I think that her ability to say that someone knows how to interact better with their inner self when they walk around naked, and their sexual partner knows better how to interact with their inner self when you walk around naked, is a complete fallacy, because those are things that you choose to divulge regardless of whether or not they see you naked or not. Let's talk about the first idea, and how I think that people can take a sense of belonging, no thanks, to the clothes that they wear. Because so far this has only been a negative thing in this debate, right? People define their membership of a group by the clothes that they wear. People define the fact that they are emo, they define the fact that they're hipster, they define the fact that they belong to a particular social group by what they wear and the way they act. Now, we've been only given this in parallel of a class divide. We think that's probably not the problem because of all the reasons that Mark gives you. We think that people are okay with buying into a social group that they want to be part of because it's okay to feel that sense of belonging. In terms of biological origin, the reason we feel that belonging is because animals that have the same markings, like zebras and leopards, there are no peacocks here, no thanks, have the same kind of familial markings, and that's how they see that there's a sense of belonging and they feel a relationship. When Emer says that, if we want you to relate to your individual self, what if I want to be part of the collective? What if I want to buy something larger? And what if I want to feel like I identify with those around you by virtue of how I look like? And what if I want them not to see my naked body? In terms of the idea of limitation, we got the idea early on from Ruth, who talked about burkas. No thanks. But that's our obsession with burkas. We see how you define your social interaction with someone by how much or how little of your body that you see. We already had all the spiel about how it's weird that we can't interact with those people in burkas because we can't see them. We think similarly, you have the same kind of problem when you look at the slut walk debate and how apparently you can't interact with those people because of how much they can see of them. We think it's not just about your acceptance of your own body, but realising that some other people in society will not accept that interaction with your body. They might be somewhat scared of it, and they might not like it. No thanks. Ruth talks about how everyone should own their own persona. We say everyone owns their own private persona, but no one owns their public persona because that's created the first time someone sees you. If the first time someone sees you, you're not happy to let them do that, that's exactly what I was talking about at the beginning of my speech when we said that you're now confessing your insecurities to those people. You should not have to confess your insecurity to someone the first time they see you on the street. Ruth.
Why is meeting talk about an act of provocation and evening talk is not?
Okay, I'm going to talk about this later on, how we think we respect certain things about the idea of personal exposure. It's actually, I'll do it right? Why do we have laws against personal exposure? Why do we have laws against indecent exposure? Why do we have laws against things like flashing, right? There are laws against things like flashing because of the intent to shock and because there are certain people who find it disgusting, right? The difference here is that Ruth has no intent to offend, no thanks, Ruth, right? But there's still shock, there's still sometimes disgust. Whether or not you think the penis is a symbol of the patriarchy or otherwise, it still is in certain circumstances, no thanks, somewhat of a threat. The reason it's somewhat of a threat is because it's reminiscent of the kind of sexual intimacy that in certain circumstances some people want to save for other people, right? Why is it the genitalia and certain parts of your body are so intimate, right? Why is there a taboo on showing certain parts of your body? It's because if you're the kind of monogamous person who wants to only deal with like one person that way at a time, it's reserved for them. They're the only person that you want to see because that's special for them. And the idea of like taking off that very final piece of clothing is meant to be exciting. The idea of the reveal that I asked Ian about in my PY is meant to be exciting. Even for promiscuous people who are happy to show like lots of people their naked bodies, they still don't show it to everyone because they still find it exciting that they can choose who gets to interact with their body in a certain way because they like the idea that people interact with nakedness and with things that are meant to be special in that way. No thanks. Like even when it comes to provocative clothing and like the whole idea of like wearing something that's long enough to cover all the essentials but short enough to keep it interesting, is that there is that kind of interest there at the end. You still can take all that last final piece and you can still keep that interesting. Like, the most excited I've ever seen Michael see me is when I was wearing gym shorts and a sports bra. He says something really weird about our relationship, but I'll leave that for assessment later on. No thanks. Okay, the last thing I'll look at is the idea of how society is created by clothing and how security is created by clothing, right? Let's look first of all, at two things, right? First of all, the tactile nature of clothing. Second of all, the creation of a very persona. I think it's totally fine for you to be able to create that very persona when and where you want. Like, why do we put babies in really soft, snuggly things, right? It's because there's a sense of security created by the fact that something is tactile and something that's next to your skin, something creates security for you, right? And it's a feeling of safety. When Ian asked that question about like why kids on the beach are happy to run around naked and things like that, it's not that they don't realise that other people are looking at them. They're totally aware of that. It's just that there's a level of like self-awareness that isn't there yet. Because the thing about child innocence is that there's an ability for those people to live in a massively sexually charged atmosphere and not realise that it's sexually charged. They don't know that there's anyone who can get off on the fact that they're running around naked. And like, we really hope there aren't. But like, at the same time, when it becomes possible for your sexual appeal to be like derivative of the fact that you are naked, you think then, in the same way those women who choose to wear burqas to cover all of their body, people should be able to cover some of their body because they want to mask that sexual appeal and limit that sexual appeal for some people and not be marked out as those who are scared of parts of their body or like ashamed of parts of their body in doing that. The very last thing I want to talk about then is the creation of very persona, because clothes changes who you are. Like the way in which you dress defines who you are in a particular day. And like that's why we fetishize the idea of inventing and reinventing yourself, that you can be a different person every time you change your clothes and every time you change your appearance. Like the fact that it's cathartic to change your appearance after a massive trauma, and the fact that we celebrate that catharsis means that we're totally fine. We love the fact that you can create a different personality for yourself. You can define the way someone interacts with you the very first time they meet you by the way they see you. But what Ruth and Ian wanted is kind of this honesty where you have to accept what you are. We're not happy to accept who we are. We're happy to cover ourselves up. We're happy not to admit to our insecurities, and we think it's quite difficult to do that for all these reasons I stand.
Close the case for side proposition.
Is it hot in here? It's just me. Ladies and gentlemen, show me your genitals. Your genitals. This debate comes down to two things, really. Firstly, I'm going to talk about sex and sexuality and that spectrum of debate. And then I'm going to talk about what we think is kind of more important, what Emer really brought to you, the person, and why we think the person is a lot more than who we create at a superficial level through our clothes, by showing how cool we are by wearing vintage t-shirts. Sex. First point, like, the problem is, at the moment, the problem presented to you by the proposition is that we are, at the moment, ashamed of our bodies, okay? And it's stemmed from a couple of things, mainly because when we were in school in our biology classes, when they put up the human body, they labelled the anatomy above the waist and then said, everything below is all shame and skin. But also because we've been conditioned to believe that we need to cover up all the time. Because what we've got underneath our clothes is something that nobody wants to see, ladies and gentlemen, and we've been told that through our entire childhood. And this presents two problems. Firstly, it presents security within ourselves, within our sexual selves, and secondly, it leads to the eroticization of the body. Okay? So in terms of like the insecurity in ourselves, this is because the media, pornography, and schoolyard banter set up unreasonable expectations of what a body should look like, what a penis should look like, what a vagina should look like, how much hair these things should have, ladies and gentlemen. And we don't think that's cool. So we think that people, like, unnecessarily set a high bar for themselves. And what we think is when we go nude, when we start taking off our clothes and embracing ourselves beyond that, we see, like, firstly we see the whole spectrum of what it means to be a person, to what it means to be naked, and for what that human body is, and what that human body has the potential to be, ladies and gentlemen. But also, we get more secure within ourselves, because we realise that we're unique, we're an individual. Like, it's not us versus pornography, you know, we don't otherwise ourselves against them, but we see ourselves as one of a collective, ladies and gentlemen. And then secondly, the idea of the eroticization of the body, okay? When this happens under both sexes, and I know that at the moment debating is all about the patriarchy, but let me tell you, as a scrawny guy, the matriarchy is pretty bad at judging this too. At the moment, sex is based around nudity. It's not based around intimacy, ladies and gentlemen. That's a problem. So we think that both of these problems are solved when we strip away from ourselves these social pressures to wear clothes and actually strip. Okay? Because Christine talked about wanting to cover up for people our flaws. Like, Christine, you're not flawed. Nobody in this room is flawed, ladies and gentlemen, and we think it's a sick idea. No, thank you. That's what you said. Wanting to hide from people your flaws. No, we think it's a sick idea that our society can tell you that you are flawed in some way, ladies and gentlemen. Nobody is. Your body, ladies and gentlemen, is not something for you to give away. It's something for you to own, and you cannot give it away until you own it, until you're happy and safe within that body, ladies and gentlemen. And that does not happen until you are happy to walk down the street and show it to everybody and say, yes, this is me, this is who I am, and I am proud of who that is. And like Sophie said, like, there's things we just don't want to see. Like she said that we can't see. Like there's people who we don't want to show people what our sexuality is. There's people who want to hide that away from people. But there's a problem in that, ladies and gentlemen, is that we assume sexuality with people. We assume that Sophie's a heterosexual. We assume that the guy in the skinny jeans and the long fringe is a homosexual, ladies and gentlemen. And that is also a problem, because that leads to people being, normalising certain sexualities and being afraid of other ones, ladies and gentlemen. And we see that that's a problem. So we think that when we throw away, and I'll take Christine on this actually. Go on.
Okay, so at the moment we can pick our time with a certain person and a certain way that we look to reveal ourselves. How many 13-year-old girls who've just hit puberty would voluntarily enjoy walking down the street naked for everyone to judge the body they're not yet comfortable in?
Do you know why, Christine? Because we have said to them that that is not an okay body. Like, they look at FHM and they see a woman who has a size 0 waist and big boobs and they think I'm lanky and I have hair growing in weird places. That's not okay. We say that when girls see other girls going through puberty, it normalizes that and makes it okay. Like, now about the pressure, okay? And we think that we live in a really shallow world, ladies and gentlemen, and we want to see beyond the superficiality of that, okay? And it's not okay, like the talk we got from the first prop is not okay about wanting to display who you are through the type of clothes you show. And this is a problem for a number of reasons. Firstly, we think it allows, like us, and we've all done it, and we all do it, to judge people automatically on what they wear. We make a value judgment on people by looking at them the very first time we meet them, rather than forcing ourselves to engage with them, rather than making ourselves want to get to know that person as a person, rather than a picture, ladies and gentlemen. And like this feeling of security that Sophie talked about, the feeling of security on our clothes, that's only because we've been taught to be insecure without it, ladies and gentlemen. That's where that security stems from. No, thank you. Okay? So, like, this sense of belonging to groups that we heard about, whether you're like an emo or whatever, belonging to groups. Like, we say, you can't choose to belong to a group until you feel you belong to yourself, ladies and gentlemen, until you are happy with that, until you feel that is the most important thing to you. And these groups Sophie talked about, that's only the first, it's only 6 minutes? Yeah. Okay, good. Like these groups Sophie talked about, like we think that these further like fear and insecurities. Like whether you're a jock, you dress as a jock because you have an insecurity of being perceived as a nerd. You dress as an emo because you have an insecurity about being perceived as a jock, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's not okay for people to have these insecurities about how people want to judge them on face value the very first time they see you. We say that when you learn to reject this kind of idea, you stop rejecting others for how they look and how they choose to look, ladies and gentlemen, and you start, like, because of the exposure and the experience of seeing people on a daily basis and seeing the whole spectrum of what the human body is, and that, like, you know, it's not Arnold Schwarzenegger who's beautiful, ladies and gentlemen. It's not like Jennifer Lopez who's beautiful, ladies and gentlemen. It's every single person in this room. Every inch of your body is beautiful, ladies and gentlemen. Embrace that.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his words and now call on Ms. Dearbhla Gorman to close the case for the opposition and the debate as a whole.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the moment, the prop seems to think the world that we live in is one of intense body hate and sex in the dark. And that's all it is. We think that's not a fair representation of the world that we live in. We think people have varying degrees of acceptance of their own bodies. That varies from day to day, from who they're hanging around with, from week to week, like depending on each individual person, right? What they want, they tell us at the end, is that they want a world where people are just wandering around naked with everything on show for the world and then probably having sex on a street corner, but not a playground, because kids are only playgrounds. So that's hard, but I'm going to move on past that. What we're saying, our entire problem on the opposition here is, why are we alienating people who are shy, or alienating people who reserve something special about the sexual act, about their own personal bodies, right? They say, get up and own your body, your beautiful, wonderful body. Ownership, and I can't believe I'm quoting property law in a debate about sex. Ownership requires control of that property. It means that if I own a house, I get to decide who comes into my house. It means I get to decide what colour I paint the front of it. I get to decide everything. That wasn't where I was going. It means I have some level of control over that. The props today, oh yeah, like obviously if you still want to wear clothes, you should, but you should be, we would prefer a world where people don't. But in reality, when we know that people are always insecure to some level, you have to recognise that most people will want to cover up to some degree. It's the same way that even though it's socially acceptable to wander around in a bikini on a beach, a lot of people will still feel insecure and prefer to wear a t-shirt because they don't like what they see. So unless you're going to say that actually we would really want a world where that happens, we don't need you to say that rationally we would like to do that. They say that once you see everyone the same, you will no longer judge them beyond that, right? I spent 6 years in a school where myself and like 600 other girls wore really hideous blue jumpers and pleated skirts. And even though we all looked very much the same, we still managed to like mark ourselves out as who was the pretty girls and who weren't the pretty girls. Just because we'll all see each other's bodies doesn't mean we'll suddenly accept them because we'll realise that that's normal. But even if even if you are the prettiest girl in the room, you're still going to compare yourself to what you see on FHM. All of that stuff is just irrational. You can't rationalise your own insecurities. You can't just tell yourself, oh, it's silly to be afraid of that. That's not how those sort of things work. So what I'm going to talk about in concluding this way, we're going to talk about the sense of security, we're going to talk about sex in public, and finally we're going to talk about the persona you're allowed to create by your clothes and why that's a good thing. Right, firstly, this idea of security. We think that the proposition has sort of like conflated the ideas of shame and shyness, ladies and gentlemen. Just because I don't wish to share everything with you doesn't mean that I'm embarrassed by that or ashamed by it. Everyone has some level of insecurity. Like everyone has some flaws that they perceive about themselves. That's perfectly normal and perfectly allowable. They say that at no point should you be allowed to express shyness because all that does is say that you are ashamed of that. And what that teaches us is not to not be ashamed, but to apologise for that shame. In the same way when Sophie talks to you about the horrible TV programme, it doesn't say those people should like face up to the body that they have and be willing to say that, look, I'm not perfect, but I'm really trying to improve it. But it focuses on the fact that they have a stand up to say that they're not perfect about that. And that's what creates fear. I think clothes are very good in that they create a physical barrier. The reason why I want to hide under my blanket is not because I think that my blanket can't is
it keeps me safe from monsters in any sort of like physical sense, rather because it makes me feel something safe on the inside. The fact I can pull a coat around me and feel more secure in myself does those things. The fact I can hide my insecurities, I can say, oh, like I think my tummy looks a bit fat, and put on a top that doesn't show off that. It means that I feel more confident in my day-to-day life. And it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. It doesn't matter if everybody else wouldn't notice my stomach. The fact that I feel that and create a sense of security myself is something positive to those things. When you don't let people feel confident and you don't recognize that everyone has insecurities, then you don't allow them the mechanisms to cope with that and live in a real world. Go ahead.
Yeah, but it's a very good coping mechanism that creates those insecurities in the first place. It's a very active feeling you have to hide them means that you don't ever accept them and just perpetuate them.
Well, perhaps that would only be true if people were all actually identical underneath their clothes. People are always going to compare that. They're always going to say that for some reason all the boys prefer this girl rather than that girl means that there's some sort of hierarchy created. The fact that I can still feel beautiful because I'm able to do something to change myself and recognize that is something positive. In terms of the idea of sex in public, right? We think the important thing about sex is your ability and your ability to choose to engage in an act. Why is it really disgusting and frightening and offensive when a guy masturbates at you, right? It's not because it comes anywhere near you, but but because that person makes you a part of their act that you never wanted to be a part of. We say that in the same way, walking down the street and being leered at as a sexual object, never having the opportunity to say, I'm not being leered at right now because I'm wearing long trousers and a baggy jumper, means I can't opt out of that. We say it's particularly dangerous in terms of the kids who look older than they are, or people who don't want to be viewed in a sexualized manner in a particular circumstance. Like if I'm a woman trying to give a presentation in the office and all the guys get hard-ons in the room, that's going to be really not only distracting but disturbing to me and undermine my own sense of self-worth outside of a sexual object, because we think that that's more than that. We say, ladies and gentlemen, as Sophie has told you, sex has unique meanings for each and understandings for each person. People choose to express that in different ways. They choose to express that at different times, whether it's at the start of a relationship or later into it, whether it's someone you just met at Coppers or someone you've known for years. All of those things mean you should have the ability to control that and engage with that in those ways. Particularly, we say with the proposition, and the first proposition, we say that we just want people to be able to have more sex in life. We say we don't necessarily want more sex, we might want better sex, but better sex means you have to have control over those things. You have to be able to engage with them. Finally, the idea of persona pillars. We think that the proposition has been absolutely scathing of the idea that anybody might ever want to feel like they belong to a group of people. They say, how dare you want like Abercrombie & Fitch to set your personality for them, right? Firstly, you take a group of kids who are all wearing Abercrombie & Fitch. They're not actually all the same. They don't actually all become the same. But then they can do a signal, they have similar behaviors or a similar interest in music or whatever else it might be, and say that I'm this sort of person. If you think if we can hang out because we are similar, and the ability to feel like you belong in that is actually quite helpful to people. It's why people want to be a part of that. Being a part of something is good and nice. It gives you the sense of security to say that within this group of people who accept me broadly for what I am, I can find out what exactly it is within that makes me unique and express that and be accepted for that within it. Like in the same way sports teams all come together and experience all those sort of things. Later then, at the end of the day, people are multifaceted. We like the idea that people can choose what they are. We like the idea that I can dress up one way one day and a different way next, and never have to be judged by that solely, or rather be able to create that impression, and never have to have someone take away something from me that feels special. For all those reasons, we're very happy.
I'd like to thank that speaker for her comments on behalf of Film and History. Hope that you've enjoyed the debate. If we could ask our judges to retire to the Phil Council room now, after which we will have a vote on the motion. Before that, if I could just run through the events that are going to occur at the close of this event. If people could form a reasonably orderly mob outside this building and wait for some Trinity volunteers in a red hoodie or just claiming to be Trinity students who will lead you more than likely to mature. So, as our judges leave, if we could put the motion to the House that this House would go nude, and we will wait for our judges to leave. Come on there. Come on, lads. On a side note, Chrissy, I was delighted to see that Liam has overcome a lot of his schoolyard general issues. Really grabbing life by the balls. Okay, and now that our judges have left, on the motion that this House would go nude, All in favour, say aye. Aye. And all against, say nay. Nay. The ayes have it. Thank you very much.